The sound of Jason Matthews' hands slamming against the table was the first crack in the tension-filled silence of the boardroom. His voice cut through the air like a knife. "Who do you think you are, barging into my meeting, you—" But as he turned toward the door, the woman standing there didn't flinch. She wasn't just another face among the employees. She was someone who would make Jason regret every word he had just spoken. The room went still, every eye darting back and forth, unsure of what was to come. But none of them knew the truth. Emily Porter was the billionaire at the helm of the company. Jason's words would soon echo in his head as he realized just how wrong he was. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. Subscribe and like. Jason's gaze, sharp and critical, was already scanning the woman before him, sizing her up with the judgmental ease of someone who believed himself above reproach. She stood at the entrance to the room, poised, every inch the professional. Her tailored navy suit hugged her form with quiet elegance, and her shoes clicked on the floor with quiet precision. Yet, despite her impeccably polished appearance, there was something about her that screamed anonymity. No one had expected her to be anything more than a low-level assistant or secretary. Certainly not someone who could command the room. Jason narrowed his eyes as he watched her stand there, an unfamiliar discomfort creeping over him. He hadn't invited her into the room, and the truth was, he didn't want her there. He hadn't expected anyone of importance to walk in. He had assumed she was just another underling, another cog in the corporate machine. She must have been misplaced, he thought. Maybe even sent to fetch something or take notes. Without a hint of recognition, he shook his head, pushing the fleeting discomfort aside. "What do you think you're doing here?" he snapped, his voice rising in authority. "This meeting's for real executives, not whatever you are. We don't have time for distractions." The room seemed to shrink. A few of the other executives, still stiff with discomfort, exchanged wary glances. Jason's presence, his self-assuredness, often held sway in these meetings. He could be sharp, and no one dared to challenge his position. Except for one person. Jason, who had long prided himself on being the dominant force in every room, had a blind spot for those who didn't fit the mold he had constructed. And this woman, this figure standing at the door, was as far from what he expected as night was from day. Her posture was steady, unshaken by his words, even as the disdain in his voice dripped from every syllable. And what surprised Jason most was the way she stared back at him with unwavering composure. Her eyes were focused, but not in a way that suggested fear or submission. It was as though she had been prepared for this moment, as if it was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Look," Jason continued, his words laced with a dangerous mix of authority and contempt. "If you're looking for something, you'd better turn around now. This is an executive board meeting, not a place for whatever you think you're doing here." A few of the other executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some were looking down at their notepads. Others glanced at the door, hoping for some resolution that would allow them to avoid the confrontation that was slowly unfolding. Jason's words were so forceful, so confident, that it was difficult for anyone to question him. For a moment, it seemed like he would be allowed to continue on unchallenged. But that's when the moment broke. The woman, still silent, stepped forward. She walked toward the center of the room as if Jason's tirade hadn't even happened, her steps deliberate, each one measured and certain. A few gasps rippled across the room as they watched her move with purpose. There was something about the way she carried herself that made it impossible to dismiss her presence. As she walked, the room seemed to fall into a deeper silence, as if holding its breath, unsure of what might happen next. Jason's patience was wearing thin. "I said leave," he growled, voice low and dangerous. "Now." But Emily, this woman who, despite being unassuming in appearance, was beginning to unsettle Jason, simply looked at him. Not in defiance, not in anger, but with something deeper, something stronger than Jason could immediately comprehend. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice soft but carrying an edge of authority that he hadn't expected. Jason blinked, surprised by the calmness in her tone. He was used to commanding respect with his booming voice, to making people quiver with the weight of his position. But this woman, whoever she was, didn't even flinch, She walked to an empty chair at the table, then turned to face the rest of the executives, settling into the seat with the kind of ease that suggested she had done this 1,000 times before. Emily Porter didn't need to say anything to command the room. Her silence, her mere presence, was enough. It was a stark contrast to Jason's erratic outbursts, the kind that usually kept people on edge. Jason's lips twisted into a sneer as he stared at her, his pride wounded. "Who do you think you are?" he asked, voice dripping with a mixture of disdain and confusion. "You think you can just sit here like you belong? You're nothing more than an assistant, a janitor, and this is no place for your type. You need to leave. Now." And just as he was about to raise his voice again, something strange happened. Emily didn't react. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering, her eyes locking onto Jason's with a quiet intensity that seemed to suck the air out of the room. It was the kind of look that spoke volumes without uttering a single word, a look that rendered Jason's words hollow, powerless. Jason's breath hitched for a split second, an unsettling feeling crawling down his spine. He could feel the weight of the room's eyes on him now. There were whispers, hushed and cautious, and for the first time he realized something wasn't right. The silence dragged on, thick and suffocating. Jason opened his mouth again to shout, to demand that she leave. But before he could utter a word, Emily placed a single, sleek, leather-bound folder onto the table. The sound of it hitting the wood seemed to reverberate around the room, loud in the quiet tension. Everyone's eyes shifted from the folder back to her. Jason, his mouth slightly open, stared at the folder, then at Emily. He opened his mouth to speak, but she beat him to it. "I'm sorry, Mr. Matthews," she said, her voice as calm as a placid lake. "But I think you've mistaken who I am." The room held its collective breath. "I'm actually the founder and CEO of this company," she continued, not a hint of hesitation in her voice. "The same company you so arrogantly think you control. I'm also the majority shareholder, and I hold a controlling stake in this corporation." The world seemed to stop. Jason's mouth hung open, his words lost in a chasm of disbelief. His gaze flickered between Emily and the folder she had placed in front of him. The legal documents she had placed there confirmed every word she had spoken. Emily Porter, the woman he had belittled, insulted, and dismissed so easily, was the very heart of the company. The one person who could make or break everything he had worked for. Jason's hand reached out, trembling, to open the folder. His fingers fumbled with the papers inside, trying to grasp the truth, but they slipped through his fingers as though they were made of smoke. His face drained of color as the documents confirmed Emily's words, the truth slamming into him like a freight train. He could barely breathe. For the first time, Jason realized that in his arrogance, in his racist assumptions, he had just dug his own grave, and there was no way out. Not this time. Not from her. As the room sank into stunned silence, Emily remained unmoved, her calm composure a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in Jason's mind. She waited, watching him absorb the reality of the situation. "Now," she said, finally breaking the silence, her voice low but clear. "Perhaps we can get back to business." And in that moment, Jason Matthews learned the most valuable lesson of his career. Power wasn't about dominance. It was about control, about grace under pressure, and about never underestimating the strength of the person you thought you could easily dismiss. It was about control, about grace under pressure, and about never underestimating the strength of the person you thought you could easily dismiss. Jason Matthews's mind was racing. His once unwavering sense of superiority had cracked in an instant, and it was almost as if time had stopped. His eyes were still locked on the folder that Emily had so calmly placed in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he ran his fingers over the papers, trying to make sense of the words in front of him. The documents, the legal proof of her ownership, her control, were a slap to his arrogance, a reality he had never considered in his wildest dreams. Emily Porter, the woman he had just humiliated, was not only the CEO of the company, but the very foundation of everything Jason had built his career upon. Her position, her wealth, her power were facts Jason had failed to notice. He had assumed that his position at the top of the food chain was unchallenged, that no one had the right to question him or, God forbid, disrespect him in such a way. His eyes flickered up to meet hers, but he couldn't maintain the gaze for long. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even upset. The calmness of her demeanor made him feel small in a way he had never experienced. Jason Matthews had spent years building his career on the back of his arrogance, on the belief that power was something you could grasp by force and intimidation. From his early days at the company, he had been the golden boy, the one who knew how to play the game, how to manipulate situations to his advantage. He had started in the mailroom, worked his way up with sheer determination, and eventually landed the role of regional manager. No one had ever doubted his ability to lead, at least, not out loud. In Jason's mind, his rise was inevitable. It was a testament to his hard work, his superior intellect, and, most of all, his innate ability to dominate. Jason had always considered himself a pragmatist. He believed in the survival of the fittest, in stepping on anyone who got in the way. He saw the corporate world as a battlefield, where only the strongest and most ruthless survived. And Jason was nothing if not ruthless. He had no time for niceties, no patience for those who didn't know their place. He had never had to, until now. He had spent years cultivating a toxic atmosphere in his region, promoting those who towed the line and casting out anyone who dared question him. His racist tendencies weren't something he hid. He was too confident for that. They were ingrained in the way he spoke, in the way he carried himself. He never trusted minorities, especially black women, believing they had no business in high-powered roles. In his eyes, they were out of their depth, and they were certainly beneath him. He justified this belief with the same arrogance that had carried him up the ranks. It wasn't just his position that he had come to see as unassailable. It was his belief in the system, the world that had allowed him to climb to the top. And now, sitting in front of him, was a woman who had defied everything he thought he knew about power. A black woman, no less, who not only owned the company but had humiliated him with a single, calm sentence. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even flinched when he insulted her. She had taken control of the situation without breaking a sweat, and Jason's carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel before his eyes. As he sat there, stunned and silent, the room shifted. The other executives, who had been awkwardly quiet up until this point, began to stir. The tension that had built up since Emily walked into the room was palpable. Some of them were shifting in their seats, unsure of how to react. Others were avoiding eye contact, afraid of drawing attention to themselves. There were a few who couldn't quite hide the smirks that tugged at the corners of their mouths. Those who had always thought Jason's bravado was a little too much, but had never had the guts to say anything. The silence in the room was suffocating. Emily's quiet presence only made it more intense. She sat there, still, unbothered by the chaos she had caused. The calmness in her eyes was enough to remind them that this was no ordinary situation. Jason had overstepped in a way that was unforgivable, and now the consequences were beginning to unfold. But Jason wasn't ready to admit defeat. The reality of his situation hadn't fully sunk in yet. The idea that he had been so completely wrong about Emily, so completely wrong about the person he had just insulted, was something his ego refused to accept. He opened his mouth again, but his voice faltered as he tried to speak. You're the CEO?" he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. He had no idea what to say next. The words that had come so easily to him just moments ago now felt like a weight he couldn't lift. The arrogance that had once defined him was slipping through his fingers, and in its place was confusion, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. This is a joke, right? You're just messing with me. There's no way." Emily didn't answer right away. She simply let him struggle, watching him with the same steady gaze that had unsettled him the moment she entered the room. And then, after a long pause, she spoke. "No, Jason," she said softly. "I'm not joking. I'm not here to play games." Jason opened his mouth again, but he had nothing left to say. The realization was starting to sink in. The foundation he had built his career on, the idea that power came from force, from belittling others, was crumbling in front of him. Emily Porter wasn't just another employee. She was the very embodiment of what he had always dismissed. She was the one person in the room who didn't need to shout, didn't need to berate him to prove her dominance. She had already done it. Without lifting a finger, without raising her voice, she had shown him exactly how weak he truly was. Across the table, the other executives were watching the exchange, their reactions a mix of surprise, discomfort, and for some, a strange sense of relief. They had all witnessed Jason's arrogance before, his tendency to belittle anyone he deemed unworthy of respect. But now, they were seeing something else. The collapse of the power structure they had all taken for granted. Some of them were squirming in their seats, too afraid to speak out or even make eye contact with Emily. They had always known Jason's behavior was toxic, but they had never done anything about it. They had allowed it to continue, perhaps because it benefited them in some way, or because they were too afraid of the fallout to speak up. Now, with Emily at the head of the table, they were faced with a choice they hadn't expected to make. Would they stand with Jason, whose behavior had been so openly oppressive, or would they recognize the change in the room, the shift in power that had just occurred? But there were others, less subtle in their discomfort, who seemed to find some dark amusement in the situation. One of the senior executives, a man named Richard, who had always supported Jason, chuckled nervously. "Well, this is certainly an interesting turn of events," he muttered, but no one laughed. No one dared to, not when they could feel the weight of Emily's gaze on them. The power dynamics had shifted, and no one in the room could pretend otherwise. Jason's attempt to control the meeting, to belittle Emily, had backfired spectacularly. And now, Emily was in control. Her calmness, her quiet confidence, had set the tone for the rest of the room. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand their attention. She had already captured it simply by being herself. As Jason sat there, his mind spinning with the reality of the situation, Emily broke the silence once again. "I'm not here to entertain your assumptions, Jason," she said, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge. "You've made your point, and I've made mine. Now, let's move forward." The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful. Everyone in the room, even the most resistant, knew who was in charge now. And though Jason's arrogance had driven him to the edge, it was Emily's grace under pressure that had brought them all to this moment of clarity. Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. He had underestimated her in every possible way. But in that moment, it was too late to change anything. The damage had been done. As the meeting continued, it was clear that things would never be the same again. Jason's outburst had been loud, his voice filled with the venom that so often accompanied his sense of entitlement. But even as he stood there, fists clenched, seething with the kind of anger that made his face flush a deep red, something was missing in his words. The authority he once commanded, the power he believed he held over those beneath him, was fading. And as his voice grew more desperate, Emily remained unmoved, a silent force in the room. The atmosphere had changed. Jason continued his tirade, his insults sharp, his contempt unmistakable. "Who do you think you are, sitting there like you belong?" His words were clipped, dripping with a barely contained rage. "You must be out of your mind if you think you can just walk in here and—" Emily's calm gaze never wavered. She hadn't flinched when he had first insulted her. She hadn't flinched when he had mocked her presence. Her composure was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling around Jason, who was losing himself to the power struggle he couldn't even see. Emily sat there like a statue, completely still, as though her mind had already moved beyond his attempts to provoke her. Jason, frustrated by her silence, took another step forward, his fists now visibly trembling. "You think you're better than me?" he spat. "Just because you can toss around some fancy title? You're nothing. You're just an imposter, playing a game you'll never win." The room was growing tense, thick with anticipation. The others in the room, executives and managers alike, watched this scene unfold with a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and fear. Some of them exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene, while others stiffened in their seats, hoping to remain invisible. Emily, however, was anything but invisible. She was the calm in the storm, the quiet eye of a hurricane of Jason's making. And yet, it wasn't her silence that spoke volumes. It was the stillness with which she carried herself. Jason's insults seemed to lose their edge as they bounced off her unwavering exterior. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout him down. She simply sat there, watching him unravel. And with every word he spat in her direction, the power in the room shifted incrementally, like a tide turning on its axis. Jason, sensing his own weakness, took a deep breath and opened his mouth again, ready to deliver the next round of insults. But before he could speak, Emily finally broke the silence, her voice cutting through the noise like a sharp blade. "Jason," she said, her voice calm and composed. "You've mistaken who I am." Her words were measured, precise, each one carrying a quiet authority. There was no hint of anger in her tone, no frustration, just a simple statement of fact. For a brief moment, Jason's mouth hung open, as if the words she had spoken hadn't quite landed in his mind. His brow furrowed, and his posture stiffened. "What?" he asked, confused. "What the hell do you mean? You think you can—" But Emily wasn't finished. She didn't allow him to finish his sentence. "I think," she said, her voice unwavering, "that you've mistaken me for someone you can belittle. But I'm not just someone in this company. I am the reason this company exists. I am the founder, and I am the majority shareholder. I hold the controlling stake of this corporation." Her words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. There was no grand declaration, no flourish, no dramatic shift in her tone. It was as if she were stating the obvious, the truth that everyone in the room should have known. The reality of her power, of her control, seemed to settle over the room with an invisible weight. Jason's jaw tightened. His face, once flushed with the heat of his outburst, had gone pale. He was still processing what Emily had just said, and for a moment, he couldn't seem to process it fast enough. His mind was racing, jumping from thought to thought, none of them landing firmly enough to make sense of what had just been revealed. You can't," Jason stammered, his voice wavering in disbelief. His usual command, the confident sneer that had accompanied his every move up until this point, was gone. Emily had torn it down with a single sentence. The power he had once believed to be his, an unshakable right, was now crumbling in his hands. As Jason fumbled for words, Emily reached into her sleek leather bag, her movements deliberate, unfazed by the spectacle unfolding before her. The others in the room were watching intently, every pair of eyes fixed on her as she retrieved a folder from the bag. The folder was clean, professional, unassuming. And yet, as she slid it across the table toward Jason, there was a heavy, almost theatrical finality in the gesture. With a steady hand, Emily pushed the folder to the center of the table, directly in front of Jason. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering, as she allowed the silence to stretch between them. Jason's gaze shifted from the folder to her face, then back to the folder, but he made no move to pick it up. It was as if he couldn't quite bring himself to touch it, as if he feared that doing so would force him to face the truth that had just been laid bare. For a moment, the room remained still. No one spoke. No one breathed. The tension was palpable, and in the silence, the shift in the room was undeniable. The energy had changed. No longer was Jason the dominant force. He was no longer the one in control. The power had shifted. Finally, with a trembling hand, Jason reached for the folder. His fingers brushed against the smooth leather, and he opened it, slowly, cautiously, as if bracing himself for the truth that would crush him. His eyes scanned the documents inside, each one a confirmation of Emily's words. The more he read, the paler his face became. He looked from the paper to Emily, his mouth opening and closing in a futile attempt to form words. But there were no words left. Nothing he could say would undo what had already been revealed. The executives around the table exchanged uneasy glances. Some were now shifting in their seats, looking at one another with wide eyes. A few couldn't hide their shock. their gazes flickering back and forth between Emily and Jason. They had witnessed Jason's arrogance, his sharp tongue, his tendency to belittle anyone he deemed beneath him. But now they were seeing something far more powerful. A woman who hadn't flinched in the face of his fury. A woman who had remained calm and collected while exposing the fragility of the man who had once seemed invincible. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Jason's face, once full of bravado, was now a picture of disbelief. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He was trapped in his own denial, unable to reconcile the woman sitting before him with the woman he had so casually dismissed just moments ago. It wasn't just her words that had shattered his perception. It was the sheer calmness with which she had revealed the truth. Emily Porter wasn't rattled by his insults. She wasn't thrown off balance by his outbursts. She had simply let him fall apart, and now he was left standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance. As the room fell into silence once more, Emily leaned back in her chair. Her expression remained calm, composed, but there was an undeniable authority in the way she carried herself. She wasn't just the CEO. She wasn't just the majority shareholder. She was something far more powerful than Jason had ever imagined. She had exposed him for what he truly was, a man whose power was nothing more than a facade, one that had crumbled in the face of someone who truly understood what it meant to lead. And as the final realization settled into Jason's mind, he knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. The room remained silent. Jason's eyes were wide, his mouth dry, as he stared at the documents in front of him, the weight of the truth sinking in. His mind was a whirlwind, his thoughts scattered, his entire sense of self unraveling. But in that moment, there was only one thing he could think. He had been wrong. So terribly, terribly wrong. And now, the silence spoke louder than any words ever could. The room was still. The tension was palpable, suffocating, hanging like a thick fog around the long table. The sound of Jason's ragged breathing was the only thing that seemed real, the only thing that broke the silence. He sat frozen, his eyes glued to the folder in front of him, as if it were a cruel joke he couldn't quite understand. But the truth was right there, staring back at him, unyielding and absolute. The shock that rippled through the room was impossible to ignore. The other executives sat in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of disbelief, guilt, and shame. Emily had made her move, unfazed, composed, and in complete control. And now, as the weight of her words settled into the hearts of those around her, it became clear that everything they had once known about their place in the company had just changed. Some of the executives seemed to shrink in their seats, their eyes darting from one another to Emily, unsure of how to respond. The man closest to the door, Mark, who had often been one of Jason's loudest supporters, avoided eye contact. His face was pale, his posture stiff with unease. He had seen Jason's behavior up close before, had even turned a blind eye to it. But now that the full extent of Emily's power had been revealed, he felt the cold sting of guilt. Others, like Sandra, looked more embarrassed than anything. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her glass of water. But the liquid inside it seemed to mock her, reminding her that nothing would ever be the same again. She had been one of the executives who had never quite agreed with Jason's harsh methods, but she had never spoken up. Now, in the face of Emily's quiet authority, Sandra realized just how complicit she had been in allowing Jason's cruelty to thrive unchecked. And then there were those like Richard, whose eyes betrayed an all-too-familiar fear. Richard had always been in Jason's corner. He admired Jason's cutthroat attitude and saw it as a way to climb the corporate ladder. But now, with Emily calmly sitting at the head of the table, the room was a very different place. Richard shifted uneasily in his seat, his earlier smirk now completely gone. He had always thought Jason's unchecked arrogance was a sign of strength. Now, he wasn't so sure. Emily's gaze swept across the room, assessing the reactions of the others. She could see the discomfort, the guilt, the fear, but she did not flinch. It was almost as if she were waiting for them to process the reality of what had just occurred. Jason had failed to see the power dynamics at play. But Emily had been playing this game long before he had even known the rules. Jason opened his mouth again, his voice slightly less sure this time, his words hesitant as he tried to regain some semblance of control. "You can't," he began, but Emily interrupted him, her voice low and unwavering. "Jason," she said calmly, cutting through his attempt to regain authority. "You've crossed a line." She paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle in, then continued, her tone hardening just slightly. "Racism, arrogance, and disrespect have no place in this company, and your actions have proven that you are not the kind of leader this company needs." Jason's face went from pale to red in an instant. His hands clenched into fists on the table, and he looked like he was about to shout, about to throw another insult. But Emily's unshakable presence kept him rooted in place. She was the storm, and he was the man trying to hold onto his umbrella in the middle of it. He opened his mouth again, a weak defense trying to form. But Emily's eyes, cold, unflinching, and steady, shut him down. She wasn't interested in hearing any more of his excuses. She had already made her decision. "Jason Matthews," she began, her voice ringing through the room with finality. "Your position as regional manager is hereby terminated, effective immediately." The words fell like a guillotine, sharp and unyielding, slicing through the air with cold precision. There was no hesitation in her delivery, no flicker of doubt. She didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The authority in her words was enough to leave Jason reeling. The room seemed to breathe in unison, everyone holding their breath as they processed what had just been said. Jason's face, already pale from the shock, drained even further as the reality of the situation began to hit him. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He was stunned, lost for the first time in a long while. The man who had once been so confident, so sure of his dominance, was suddenly reduced to a shell of his former self. "Security will escort you from the building," Emily continued, her tone as calm and composed as before. "I suggest you gather your things quickly and leave quietly. We don't tolerate racism here." Jason's hands trembled as he reached for the folder on the table, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. He couldn't wrap his mind around what was happening. His mind was still spinning, trying to process how everything had spiraled out of his control so quickly. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his position and his words would never come back to haunt him. But now, in the face of Emily's cold, calm response, he realized just how wrong he had been. "You can't do this!" he shouted, his voice cracking as he stood up from his chair, his face contorting with rage. "I'm the regional manager. I built this company up. You can't just—" "I just did," Emily interjected smoothly, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "And I will not tolerate this behavior from anyone, regardless of their title." The finality in her voice left no room for argument. Jason's mouth snapped shut, his hands balling into fists at his sides. His usual bravado, his arrogant confidence, were gone. The truth was staring him in the face, and he couldn't escape it. The silence in the room stretched for a moment longer, everyone unsure of how to proceed. The transformation that had occurred was undeniable. Emily had not only taken control of the situation, she had completely reshaped the dynamic in that room. Her dominance was not born from fury, nor from a need to prove herself. It was born from something deeper, the quiet strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for. She didn't need to shout to command respect. Her presence alone was enough to shift the entire balance of power in that room. Jason's attempt at dominance had been nothing more than a fleeting illusion. And now, with the truth exposed, he was left with nothing but the wreckage of his own actions. As Jason was escorted out of the room by security, his face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and rage, Emily remained seated at the head of the table. She didn't look at him as he was escorted away. She didn't need to. The power in the room had already shifted, and Jason, for all his arrogance and pride, was no longer in control. The other executives sat frozen, unsure of what to do, their eyes darting nervously from one another to Emily. but Emily's gaze was steady. She wasn't looking for their approval. She wasn't looking for applause. She had already done what needed to be done. She had asserted her authority, shown them what real power looked like. And now she would take the next step. "Let this be a lesson," Emily said, her voice cutting through the stillness of the room. "In this company, we value respect above all else. There is no room for racism, arrogance, or intolerance. We are a team, and we will work together, or we will not work at all." Her words rang out, clear and unambiguous. The executives were still processing the moment, still reeling from the shock of what had just happened. But as Emily's eyes swept across the room, it became clear that her leadership was no longer a question. It was a fact. And anyone who couldn't accept that would soon find themselves on the wrong side of the company's future. The room had changed. Jason's departure was just the beginning. The company would be different now, led by a woman who understood that true power wasn't about domination. It was about respect, and the ability to enforce that respect without ever raising your voice. As Emily stood up from the table and turned to leave, her steps were measured, each one firm and purposeful. She was no longer just the woman who had been underestimated. She was the leader of the company, and no one would forget that again. As she walked out of the room, the others remained silent, each of them aware that the power dynamics had shifted for good. Nothing would ever be the same again. Jason Matthews' mind was spinning. Every part of his body seemed to freeze in disbelief as Emily's words echoed in his ears, louder than anything he had ever imagined. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of rage and confusion surging through him. How could this be happening? He had always been the one in control. He had been the regional manager for years, had led the company's most profitable branch, made decisions, given orders. And yet, here he was, sitting at the mercy of a woman who had just revealed herself as the owner of the very company he had built his career on. The room was still, the air thick with tension. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him as Emily, with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before, made her announcement. His termination was no longer a threat, it was a reality. And even now, as he fumbled with the legal documents she had placed in front of him, he couldn't quite bring himself to accept it. "I don't believe you," Jason muttered, the words barely escaping his lips, a weak deflection in the face of his own disbelief. He looked at the folder in his hands again, the same folder that had shattered his world just minutes ago. But it was still there, irrefutable. Emily remained calm, her gaze steady, not an ounce of pity or anger in her expression. "It's not about belief, Jason. It's about facts," she said simply. Her voice was firm, each word a reminder of the power she wielded. Jason slammed the folder down on the table, his frustration building. "This is outrageous!" His voice was hoarse now, lacking the same confidence he'd once had. His usual arrogance was now a shell, cracking under the weight of Emily's quiet authority. He couldn't understand how it had come to this. He had spent years climbing this ladder, working his way to the top, and now it felt as though it had all been for nothing. His anger was rising, and the more he fought to hold on to his pride, the more it slipped from his grasp. He looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who would stand with him. But instead of the usual camaraderie, the executive team was silent. They weren't speaking up in his defense, not offering a word of support. They were watching him like spectators at the scene of a car wreck, their eyes wide, their expressions a mixture of fear, discomfort, and, perhaps, guilt. "You can't just fire me," Jason continued, his voice trembling with growing fury. "I've been here longer than any of these people. I've made this company what it is, and you—" He pointed a finger at Emily, his voice cracking with a mix of desperation and anger. "You're just going to throw it all away? You're nothing but a—" "I am your boss, Jason," Emily interrupted, her voice unwavering, calm as the eye of a storm. "You no longer have any authority here. You're terminated. There's no debate. And your actions, your behavior, will not be tolerated in this company." Jason's eyes narrowed in fury. "You don't get to do this," he spat, his fists clenched on the table. His mind was clouded with a mixture of indignation and confusion. This was his life. This was his power. And now it was slipping away, disintegrating like dust between his fingers. The truth, however, had already been spoken. Emily had made her decision. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vindictive. She was simply decisive. Her leadership was absolute. Without missing a beat, Emily stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Jason's, as if to remind him of who was in control. She moved toward the door, her every step radiating calm authority. Jason shot to his feet, his hands now shaking, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and humiliation. He wasn't about to let this go down quietly. "No!" he snarled, taking a step toward her, his voice rising in pitch. "I don't care who you are. You can't just—" The door to the room opened quietly, and 2 security guards stepped inside. They stood at attention, their presence a silent reinforcement of Emily's words. "Jason Matthews," one of the guards said in a low, authoritative voice, "you are to leave the premises immediately." Jason's eyes widened in shock. He looked from the guards to Emily, as if he had just realized that he was no longer in control. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "No," Jason finally said, his voice desperate. "This isn't happening. I'm the regional manager. You can't just—" "Mr. Matthews," Emily said, her tone not unkind but firm. "You've been given a direct order. I suggest you cooperate." Her eyes never left him. "You have 2 options. Leave now, quietly, or be escorted out." Jason's face flushed, his sense of self-worth crumbling with each passing second. He tried to pull himself together, to reassert his dominance, but the words came out unevenly. "I built this company. I made it—" One of the security guards stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "Jason Matthews, please. You need to leave the building." Jason's fists clenched tighter. He looked around at the people in the room again, his desperation growing. "This isn't how this ends. You'll regret this," he yelled, his voice trembling with frustration. But Emily wasn't moved by his threats. She remained composed, her voice cutting through the tension. "You will regret nothing, Jason. The only thing you will regret is how you treated the people who worked for you." She stepped back slightly, allowing the security to step forward, closing in on him. "Let's go, Mr. Matthews," the second guard said, his tone firm but not unfriendly. Jason hesitated, as if his pride was telling him to fight back, to shout and demand a chance to make things right. But deep down, he knew it was futile. His authority had evaporated the moment Emily had stood up to him. He had no power left. With one last angry look at Emily, Jason lunged toward the table, grabbing his things hastily. The folder with the legal documents, the papers that had sealed his fate, slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor with a soft thud. But Jason didn't notice. He was already marching toward the door, his mind swirling with the bitter taste of defeat. The security guards flanked him, each step he took growing heavier, more painful. Every glance he cast around the room was filled with resentment. His colleagues, the executives he had once commanded, now sat quietly, some too afraid to meet his gaze. Others looked uncomfortable, embarrassed by the scene unfolding before them. "Jason!" Emily called after him, her voice still composed but carrying a quiet authority. "Before you leave, let me make something very clear. Discriminatory behavior of any kind will not be tolerated in this company. We will not tolerate anyone who brings harm to the workplace or fosters a culture of disrespect." Jason stopped for a moment, his back to her, his hands still clenched in anger. But there was no turning back now. He had already lost. The damage he had done to his own reputation was irreversible. The security guards were already at the door, waiting for him to leave. With a final, bitter glance at Emily, Jason marched out of the room, his head held high, but the sense of defeat obvious in his every movement. The door shut behind him with a quiet click, and the room was left in stunned silence. Emily took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing. It was done. Jason Matthews was no longer a threat to the company, and now, with his departure, she could begin the work of rebuilding, of creating the culture she had always intended for this company, a place where respect and integrity would be paramount. As the room slowly came back to life, the executives turned toward Emily, unsure of how to proceed. But she was already in control, her calm presence a stabilizing force. Without a word, she turned to the remaining team members. "Let's get to work," she said, her voice as steady as ever. "And remember, any behavior like that will be reported. I expect professionalism from all of you going forward. Now, if there are any questions, let's hear them." Her calm leadership was a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. The room was different now. The power dynamics forever shifted. The age of unchecked arrogance and cruelty was over. And with Emily at the helm, the future of the company looked not only bright, but just. As the door to the conference room clicked shut behind Jason Matthews, the tension in the room seemed to breathe out in a collective sigh. But the silence that followed was not one of relief. It was thick with uncertainty, confusion, and even a sense of unease that clung to the air. The executives who had sat in silence, watching the downfall of a man they had all known in one capacity or another, now found themselves caught in the wake of the power shift Emily had so decisively orchestrated. They sat still, unsure of what to do next, their eyes flickering between Emily and one another. There was no question about it. This was a turning point. But what that meant for each of them was still unclear. Some were visibly relieved, their tension unwinding as the truth had been laid bare. These were the ones who had been quietly uncomfortable with Jason's behavior, who had long whispered about his arrogance and the toxic culture he fostered, but who had never had the courage to stand up to him. They were the ones who had quietly let his cruelty slide by, or worse, tacitly accepted it. But with Jason gone, they now had the chance to breathe. Only they weren't sure how to breathe with the new air Emily had introduced into the room. Others, however, were more hesitant, their faces betraying a different emotion. Embarrassment, guilt, shame. These were the ones who had been complicit in Jason's reign. They had nodded along to his jokes, looked the other way when he made a racist comment, or shrugged off his belittling behavior toward employees. They had climbed the corporate ladder with Jason, reaping the benefits of his bullying, even as they told themselves that they were simply playing the game. Now, with the game being turned on its head, they were left to wrestle with their own actions, or lack thereof. Sandra, one of the senior executives, shifted in her seat uncomfortably. She had long admired Jason's ability to get things done, to be ruthless in ways that others were too afraid to be. She had convinced herself that his behavior was just a byproduct of the pressure to succeed. But now, with Emily's cool, measured authority taking the reins, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that she had allowed the company's culture to become toxic under her watch. The guilt gnawed at her insides. She had sat through countless meetings where Jason had mocked or belittled others, yet she had never said anything. She had laughed at his jokes, not because she found them funny, but because it was easier than confronting him. Now, her complicity felt like a weight she couldn't escape. Mark, another senior executive, avoided eye contact with Emily. His posture was stiff, and his hands fidgeted nervously on the table. Mark had always been one of Jason's staunchest defenders. He had justified Jason's harsh methods as necessary for getting results, for maintaining control, for keeping things in line. He had never thought that Jason's behavior might be undermining the very values the company claimed to uphold. Now, as Emily's sharp, unwavering gaze swept over him, he realized how wrong he had been. There was no longer any room for excuses. He had witnessed it all. The insults, the favoritism, the casual racism. But he had never once stepped in to stop it. His mind was racing, trying to justify his inaction. But there was no rationalization that could erase the guilt that was now creeping in. The company was changing, and Mark wasn't sure he was ready to face the changes that would be required of him. Across the room, Richard, the man who had once shared Jason's sharp-edged views, sat with his back ramrod straight. He had been quick to align himself with Jason, drawn to his brashness and his ability to command a room. But now, with Jason gone and Emily in full control, Richard found himself in an unfamiliar position, uncertain and small. He had never expected Emily to be the kind of leader who could stand up to Jason. In his mind, she had always been the quiet, behind-the-scenes type, the one people overlooked. But now, it was clear that Emily was far more than that. She had dismantled Jason with quiet decisiveness, without so much as raising her voice. And now, in the wake of his departure, Richard was forced to confront a reality he hadn't prepared for. Emily was in charge. And that fact, though undeniable, left him unsettled. Emily's presence in the room was a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Her composure, her cool authority, were undeniable. But it was more than just her presence. It was her confidence, the way she spoke and moved, that signaled the shift. She was no longer the quiet figure they had assumed she was. She was now their leader, and her quiet power was a force that they couldn't ignore. "Now that we've dealt with that," Emily began, her voice calm and steady, her eyes sweeping over the room, "I want to make something very clear." The room fell silent once more, every eye on her. "This company will no longer tolerate discriminatory behavior," Emily said, her words sharp and direct. "Jason Matthews's actions were a reflection of a toxic culture that we will no longer allow to thrive. From this moment forward, respect, integrity, and professionalism will be the foundation of how we do business. No exceptions." The clarity in her words rang through the room like a bell, and for the first time in a long while, the executives seemed to take a collective breath. It was as if the weight of the years of tacit acceptance had been lifted from their shoulders. But Emily's message was unmistakable. Things were changing, and they would need to change with it. "From today," she continued, "I will be restructuring the leadership within this company. We are going to create a more diverse, inclusive, and accountable workplace. No more complacency. No more turning a blind eye. And no more fostering environments that allow toxic behavior to go unchecked." The room was still, but Emily could feel the undercurrent of anxiety, of fear. Some of them had grown comfortable with the way things had been, with the way they had benefited from Jason's leadership. But those days were over. And as Emily continued speaking, her words began to take shape as promises, as concrete plans for a future that would be built on integrity and respect. "I'll be implementing new diversity and inclusion initiatives," she said. "We will be providing training across all levels of the company, and I expect every one of you to participate fully. I will also be appointing a new head of HR, someone who understands the importance of creating a fair and equitable workplace for everyone. This company is built on talent, hard work, and respect, not on fear or intimidation." Sandra, who had been listening intently, felt a shift within herself. Emily's words were exactly what she had been waiting for, though she had never known how to voice it. The culture Jason had fostered had kept her quiet, had made her doubt her own voice. But now, hearing Emily speak so plainly, so decisively, Sandra felt a spark of hope for the first time in a long while. Maybe she could be a part of the change. Maybe she could finally confront her own complicity and help make things right. But it would take work. It would take effort. And it would take a willingness to challenge the very systems that had allowed Jason's behavior to thrive. Mark, on the other hand, felt a deep unease settling in his stomach. Emily's words were clear, and they left no room for ambiguity. He had been part of the problem for far too long, too afraid to speak up, too willing to align himself with Jason. Now, as Emily outlined the changes she planned to make, Mark realized that his position in the company was far from secure. His lack of action, his passive complicity, were no longer acceptable. Emily wasn't just cleaning house. She was reshaping it entirely, and Mark was unsure where he fit in this new vision. Richard, too, was wrestling with the idea of change. He wasn't sure if Emily's leadership was something he could get behind. The ruthlessness he had admired in Jason now seemed like a distant memory, something that had no place in this new environment. Richard had always thought power came from dominance, from making people fear you. But Emily wasn't about fear. She was about respect. And that left him feeling uncertain. Emily's power moves were clear. She wasn't waiting for approval, for validation, from the group. She was taking control. and with each passing moment, it became clear that her vision for the company was one that would no longer tolerate the toxic behavior that had allowed Jason to rise to power in the first place. "We are not starting from scratch," Emily concluded, "but we are making a fresh commitment to the kind of culture we want to build. The kind of culture that will ensure everyone has the opportunity to succeed, to feel valued, and to contribute their best work without fear of discrimination or retribution." As she finished speaking, she looked across the table at the executives. Some met her gaze with newfound respect, others with trepidation. But none of them could deny that the company was entering a new chapter, one that would be defined not by arrogance or fear, but by respect, accountability, and the promise of something better. The room remained silent, but Emily knew that change was already underway. The door to the executive offices had barely closed behind Jason Matthews when his mind began to churn. The sting of humiliation had not faded. It had only grown sharper with every passing second. Emily's calm authority, her unflinching decision to strip him of everything he had worked for, had cut deeper than any insult could. And as the security guards had escorted him out, his anger had only intensified. He had spent years carving his name into the company's history, building his reputation, and now it was all crumbling in an instant. The feeling of powerlessness was suffocating. Jason had always been in control. He had demanded respect, even when he hadn't earned it. He had bullied his way to the top, leveraging his position to intimidate others. But now, with Emily in charge, that control was gone, and Jason couldn't stand it. He couldn't stomach the idea of Emily, a woman, especially a black woman, taking the reins of the company he had always believed he deserved to rule. He couldn't leave quietly. He refused to. As soon as he reached his car, Jason pulled out his phone and began typing. The words came quickly, fueled by his anger. He had contacts throughout the company, employees who had long grumbled about the changes Emily had made in her brief tenure as CEO. He wasn't the only one who resented the new direction. He had been at the center of a storm for far too long. But now, it was time to spread that storm to others. The messages were simple. Emily Porter's rise to power was a mistake. She doesn't understand the business. She's going to run this company into the ground. Jason wasn't sure if he believed any of it himself, but the seed of doubt was enough. He had nothing left to lose. If he couldn't be the one in charge, then no one else could either. It didn't take long for his words to spread. The emails, the whispered rumors, the phone calls. Jason had made sure that the disgruntled employees and those who had been loyal to him would start to question the very foundation of Emily's leadership. It was an insidious plan, but Jason knew how to work the system. He had always known how to manipulate people. He told anyone who would listen that Emily was unqualified, that she was nothing more than a figurehead, and that her so-called leadership was simply a product of her wealth and status. Jason's anger was now a tool, one he wielded like a weapon, attempting to tear apart everything Emily had built. But what Jason didn't know, what he hadn't counted on, was Emily's quiet, unyielding strength. She had already anticipated his reaction. She had seen men like him before, those who couldn't handle losing control, those who were willing to lash out in any way they could to regain a sliver of power. And this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. Emily's decision to confront Jason's attempts to undermine her was not born of anger, but of clarity. She had no intention of allowing anyone, least of all a disgraced former executive, to take down the company she had worked so hard to protect. She understood the power of silence, but she also understood the power of action. Within a few hours of Jason's first whispers, Emily had already called a meeting with the heads of HR and legal. She knew Jason would try to rally support, to stir up discontent among the employees who felt overlooked or undervalued under her leadership. But instead of reacting with anger or defensiveness, she made a decision that would set the tone for the future: transparency. The next day, a company-wide email went out. It was simple, direct, and unmistakably clear. To all employees, as you know, there have been recent changes within our organization, including the dismissal of Jason Matthews from his position as regional manager. I understand that these changes may have caused some concern or confusion. It is crucial to me that everyone in this company feels valued and heard. In light of recent events, I want to address the rumors that have been circulating about the company's future under my leadership. These rumors are false, and I will not tolerate any form of divisiveness or misinformation. As a company, we are committed to fostering an environment of respect, integrity, and accountability. I will not allow anyone to tear down what we have worked so hard to build. If you have concerns, I encourage you to come forward. Our HR department is available to address any questions you may have, and we will be conducting a full investigation into any claims or actions that have occurred during Jason Matthews' tenure with the company. I ask that we all remain professional and work together to ensure that we continue to grow and succeed as one unified team. Thank you for your continued dedication and hard work. Sincerely, Emily Porter, CEO. The email went out to thousands of employees, each one with the opportunity to voice their concerns, to be heard. But Emily had made sure that there would be no room for ambiguity. She wasn't just making a statement. She was setting a new standard for how things would be done. No more whispers behind closed doors. No more rumors left to fester. Jason, of course, was furious. The response was nothing like he had imagined. His plan to rally support had fizzled out almost immediately. Some employees reached out, asking for clarification, but they didn't share his anger. Instead, they seemed reassured, their doubts replaced with the clarity that Emily had promised. They saw her not as a figurehead, but as a leader who was not afraid to take action. Jason's attempts to manipulate the narrative had failed, but he wasn't ready to accept defeat. The anger that had driven him was still there, still burning inside him. But it was no longer the fire that would light his path. It was the fire that consumed him. In his growing desperation, Jason took things a step further. He made calls to his former colleagues, now trying to turn their silence into complicity. He tried to create chaos, to bring others down with him. But his influence had already begun to wither. People had seen what happened to him. They had witnessed Emily's strength, her clarity, and her ability to lead with integrity. It wasn't just that Jason had been fired. It was that Emily had exposed him for what he truly was. And in doing so, she had shown everyone else what leadership looked like. Emily wasn't finished yet. She knew Jason would continue to lash out. She knew that his pride and arrogance would push him to try and regain control, even if it meant causing more damage. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She had made it clear that no one was above the company's ethical standards, not even a man who had been so influential for so long. The decision to take legal action against Jason was a difficult one, but it was one Emily knew had to be made. She had to send a clear message to anyone who might think of undermining her leadership in the future. Jason's defamation and harassment had crossed a line, and Emily would not tolerate it. It wasn't about revenge. It was about upholding the values she had promised to instill in the company. She sat in her office, her gaze focused on the documents in front of her. Legal had already drafted the necessary paperwork, and now it was time for her to take the final step. She signed the papers with a firm hand, the weight of the decision settling in. Jason Matthews will be held accountable for his actions, Emily murmured to herself. And anyone who thinks they can challenge my authority will learn the same lesson. Emily's voice was steady, her resolve unshaken. She knew that her leadership was not just about maintaining power. It was about creating a space where respect, accountability, and integrity were non-negotiable. And in that moment, she felt the full weight of her role. It wasn't about being liked or even about being feared. It was about making the company stronger, making it better. And nothing, not even Jason Matthews, would stand in her way. As Emily made the call to initiate the legal proceedings, she knew it would be a long battle. But this time, she was ready. This was her company now, and she would protect it from anyone who tried to destroy it from within. The aftermath of Jason Matthews' departure had left a gaping hole in the company's leadership. But for Emily, it wasn't a void. It was an opportunity. The company had been built on a foundation of power struggles and unspoken rules that many had simply learned to accept. But Emily wasn't interested in maintaining the status quo. She wasn't here to preserve the toxic culture Jason had fostered. She was here to reshape it, to create something stronger, fairer, and, most importantly, more sustainable. It was time for a reckoning. In the weeks following Jason's dismissal, Emily wasted no time in setting the groundwork for the changes she intended to implement. She understood that the foundation of the company, its culture, had to be rebuilt from the ground up. It wasn't just about new policies or fresh initiatives. It was about creating a shift in the mindset of every employee, from the executives at the top to the workers at the bottom. It was about creating an environment where respect was non-negotiable and accountability was the bedrock upon which everything was built. The first step was the launch of her diversity initiative, one that would be the cornerstone of her strategy for the company's future. Emily knew that diversity was not just a box to check, but a fundamental driver of creativity, innovation, and productivity. To her, it wasn't just about hiring more people from diverse backgrounds. It was about building a culture where those voices could thrive, where employees felt seen, heard, and valued. She called a company-wide meeting to unveil the new initiative. It was a bold move, one that would make her stance on the company's future clear. As she stood before a room filled with employees, the weight of the moment was not lost on her. The eyes that had once looked at her with skepticism were now watching her with something different. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps hope, but definitely expectation. "Good morning," Emily began, her voice steady, calm, and unwavering. "As you know, this company has been through a lot in the past few months. But we are not here to dwell on the past. We are here to move forward, together. The changes we're implementing will not be quick or easy. They will require us all to be better, to do better. But I am confident that we can rise to the occasion. I will not tolerate discrimination or any behavior that undermines the dignity of others. We are better than that." A hush fell over the room as Emily continued. "Today, I am proud to introduce our new Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. This initiative will focus on three main areas: equality in hiring and promotion, a culture of transparency, and creating accountability at every level of the organization. We will have clear, measurable goals, and we will hold ourselves accountable to them." The employees listened intently as Emily outlined her vision. She explained that the company would no longer tolerate any form of discrimination, whether it was based on race, gender, sexual orientation, or any other factor. She introduced mandatory training sessions on unconscious bias, inclusivity, and respectful workplace behavior. But Emily didn't stop there. She made it clear that diversity wouldn't just be a set of initiatives. It would be integrated into the company's DNA, into everything they did. "I am committed to creating a space where everyone can thrive, where everyone can contribute their unique talents and perspectives," Emily said, her voice unwavering. "And that means making sure that no one is ever made to feel inferior, unseen, or unimportant in this company. This is just the beginning. We will take concrete steps to ensure that we have a truly diverse leadership team, that we are recruiting and promoting based on merit, and that we are creating an environment that is as inclusive as it is innovative." The impact of Emily's words was immediate. The room, once tense and uncertain, began to stir with energy. Employees who had been quietly waiting for change now felt empowered, as if they had been given permission to speak up, to demand a workplace that respected them. It was clear that Emily was laying down the foundation for something bigger than any one person. She was creating a company culture that would no longer allow silence to perpetuate inequality. But while many were excited by the prospect of change, Emily knew that not everyone would welcome it. Some would resist, clinging to the comfort of the old ways, and she was prepared for that. As the days passed, the effects of Emily's new initiatives began to take shape. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't always smooth, but the shift was undeniable. Employees who had once feared speaking up now found their voices. The internal communication channels that had once been used to spread gossip and whispers about leadership began to carry messages of support and collaboration. The training sessions, while initially met with reluctance by some, slowly began to yield results. Employees were beginning to reflect on their own biases and behaviors, and in doing so, they were helping to change the very culture of the company. The diversity initiative started to show tangible results. The company saw an increase in the hiring of women and minorities in leadership roles, as well as a more diverse range of candidates applying for positions across the organization. Emily's team, once homogeneous, was now a vibrant reflection of the diverse world the company served. For the first time in a long time, the leadership team truly reflected the values they were striving to uphold. But the shift wasn't just in hiring or training. It was in the everyday actions of employees and executives alike. There was a new sense of accountability in the air. Where once, toxic behaviors had been ignored or brushed aside, now they were met with swift action. Discrimination, bigotry, and harassment were no longer just issues to be dealt with later. They were immediately addressed, investigated, and dealt with. No longer could anyone hide behind their title, their position, or their years of service. Everyone, from the top down, was held to the same standard. This wasn't without resistance. There were those who had been deeply entrenched in the old system, who had benefited from the way things were, and they weren't going to give up their privilege easily. Some executives, in particular, struggled to adjust to the new culture Emily was cultivating. They had been part of the old guard, the ones who tolerated Jason's behavior, the ones who had allowed power dynamics to go unchecked. Now, they found themselves faced with an entirely new set of expectations. Richard, one of the more senior executives, was one of the first to show signs of discomfort. He had always aligned himself with Jason's aggressive, domineering style of leadership. The idea of leading with empathy, of creating a workplace where respect was paramount, was foreign to him. At first he tried to ignore the changes, hoping they would fade over time. But as Emily's vision took hold, he found himself growing more and more alienated. The company's new direction clashed with his own values, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was becoming irrelevant. Mark, another executive, found himself in a similar predicament. He had never been as close to Jason as Richard, but he had still benefited from the old ways. His hesitation to fully embrace Emily's changes was rooted in his fear of being exposed for his own complicity in the previous culture. But as Emily continued to push for more open communication, more transparency, and more accountability, Mark found himself slowly changing. He began to reflect on his own actions, the ways in which he had turned a blind eye to inappropriate behavior, and he realized that he, too, had a responsibility to do better. It wasn't easy, but Emily's unwavering commitment to the new values gave him the push he needed to start making changes in his own approach to leadership. Emily didn't shy away from these struggles. She knew that transformation would be hard, that some people would resist, but she also knew that it was necessary. As she addressed the resistance within the leadership team, she remained firm but fair. "I will not tolerate behavior that undermines the values we're working so hard to instill," she said. "If you can't adapt, if you can't lead with respect, then perhaps this is no longer the right place for you. But if you're willing to change, if you're willing to evolve, I'll work with you. We are in this together." For Emily, the journey of transformation was not just about looking ahead. It was about confronting the past. It was about acknowledging the ways in which the company had failed its employees, the ways in which power had been abused, and the ways in which the culture had allowed toxic behavior to thrive unchecked. But confronting the past wasn't about dwelling on guilt or shame. It was about moving forward with intention and purpose. Emily wasn't interested in punishing those who had been complicit in the old system. She was interested in creating a new standard, one where the past could not define their future. As she continued to navigate the company's transition, Emily faced challenges from all sides. Some executives and employees struggled with the changes, resisting the shift in culture. But Emily remained determined. She knew the road ahead would be long, but the foundation was being laid for something truly transformative. She was creating a culture where people were valued for their contributions, not their ability to conform. And slowly, but surely, the company began to thrive under her leadership. It was late afternoon when Emily sat in her office, looking out over the sprawling cityscape. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the skyline. The bustling energy of the city outside seemed so far removed from the quiet of her thoughts. The weight of the day's decisions, the changes she had made, and the road she had traveled over the past few months, all seemed to converge in this moment of reflection. She leaned back in her chair, her hands resting on the desk in front of her. The world outside her office window was still moving, but inside, there was a sense of peace, a quiet victory. Emily had fought hard for this, both for herself and for the company she had built from the ground up. The journey hadn't been easy, and the road ahead was still filled with challenges. But Emily had never been one to shy away from hard work. She had started with nothing but a vision and the tenacity to see it through. Years ago, when she had founded the company, she had known there would be obstacles, but she hadn't anticipated the magnitude of the battles she would face, not just in the corporate world, but in overcoming the systemic biases and prejudices that were woven into the fabric of the very industry she was trying to change. The memory of her early days in the business world seemed like a lifetime ago. Emily had been young, ambitious, and determined to prove herself in a male-dominated industry that often relegated women, especially women of color, to the sidelines. She had faced countless rejections, endured endless condescension, and fought to carve out space in a world that didn't always welcome her. But every setback had only strengthened her resolve. Every no had fueled her drive to turn it into a yes. She had learned to navigate the complexities of business with intelligence and integrity, building a company that was grounded in those very values. The early years had been a whirlwind of sleepless nights, endless meetings, and constant striving. But despite the hurdles, Emily had built something solid, something that would withstand the tests of time. Now, with the company thriving under her leadership, Emily could finally see the fruits of her labor. The culture she had fought to create, a culture of respect, inclusivity, and accountability, was beginning to take root. And though the road to this point had been filled with difficult decisions, the result was a company that was stronger, more resilient, and more united than ever before. As she sat there, reflecting on her journey, Emily realized that her victory wasn't just in the success of the company or in the corporate gains she had made. The real victory was in the way she had navigated the challenges she faced, the way she had wielded power, not through anger, force, or intimidation, but through calm, quiet strength. Jason Matthews had been a powerful figure within the company, and his downfall had been dramatic. But Emily didn't need to shout to prove her authority. She didn't need to make a spectacle of herself. She had understood early on that the true power of leadership wasn't in making noise or taking control by force. The real power was in composure. It was in the ability to listen, to understand, and to act with purpose. It was in staying calm in the face of adversity, even when everything around you seemed to be unraveling. Her strength lay in her ability to remain steady, to remain grounded, even when the pressure mounted. She hadn't needed to prove herself to anyone. She had known, deep down, that she had earned her place in the world, and that knowledge had given her the confidence to lead without resorting to the tactics that many others use to dominate and control. Her leadership was rooted in integrity, an integrity that made her actions speak louder than words. The real power, Emily understood, was the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity and remain true to yourself. It wasn't about being invulnerable or untouchable. It was about knowing that you could weather any storm with grace, and that no one could strip you of your dignity. Emily stood up from her desk, walked to the window, and looked out at the city once more. The company was thriving. The changes she had implemented, the diversity initiatives, the focus on transparency, and the culture of accountability, had begun to show results. The employees felt safer, more empowered, and more valued. They were speaking up, pushing back against discrimination and prejudice, and the company was flourishing because of it. The transformation had been slow, but the momentum was undeniable. And Emily was at the helm, leading with the same quiet strength that had carried her from the very beginning. As she reflected on the journey, Emily thought about how far the company had come. It had grown beyond her original vision, beyond her wildest expectations. She had built something that was not just successful, it was sustainable, built on a foundation of respect and inclusivity. A foundation that would ensure the company could stand the test of time, no matter what challenges the future held. But even as the company thrived, Emily knew that the work wasn't done. Change was a continuous process, not a destination. She was still leading the charge, still pushing for a better, more inclusive future for her employees. She wasn't going to stop until every single person in the company felt like they had a place at the table. And yet, despite the challenges ahead, there was a sense of peace within her. She had done what many thought was impossible. She had taken a company plagued by division and toxicity and turned it into a place where people felt safe, respected, and empowered. She had created something that would last. Emily smiled softly to herself as she watched the city lights flicker to life below her. She had already built a legacy. But now, she had the chance to shape the future, not just for her company, but for the people who would come after her. The lesson Emily had learned throughout her journey was simple but profound. True power lies in self-respect and the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. She had learned that the world would throw countless obstacles in your path. People who would doubt you, challenge you, and try to hold you back. But what they couldn't take from you was your integrity, your values, and your belief in yourself. Those were the things that defined her success. Those were the things that had allowed her to rise above the challenges, to lead with grace and strength, and to create something truly lasting. As Emily stood in front of the window, looking out at the city she had once dreamed of changing, she knew that her work was far from over. The journey of transformation was never complete, but she was ready to continue pushing forward, to continue leading with integrity, and to continue inspiring others to do the same. Her legacy was not just in the company she had built, but in the lives she had touched, the change she had fostered, and the example she had set. And as she turned away from the window and walked back to her desk, she knew that the true measure of her success wasn't in the number of deals closed or the profits made. It was in the quiet strength with which she had led, and the culture of respect and equality she had created in the company she had built from the ground up. Emily Porter had become not just a billionaire, but a beacon of strength, resilience, and grace. And her story was just beginning.